And among the first to actually do it were the Mau Mau in Kenya. That was 1954. Now, by the time we get to 1961, 1962, Malcolm X was talking about we need a Mau Mau revolution here in the United States. In 1962, some young individuals, including Maxwell Stanford and Donald Freeman, started having a discussion with Malcolm X. This was 1962. And out of that, it was decided that a nationalist movement needed to intensify in the United States. Maxwell Stanford started study clubs under the direction of Queen Mother Audley Moore and Ella Baker of SNCC. And they went to the civil rights movement and they gathered those that were disaffected, 1954 to the 1961, 62, this civil rights era. We were doing nonviolent demonstrations, protests, and some in the civil rights movement were now growing frustrated that it was not achieving the results that we needed to liberate ourselves. And they became more militant. And out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, there was a faction of disaffected militants who started listening to the teachings of Queen Mother Audrey Moore, who was talking about we are a nation within a nation. They started listening to Ella Baker, who was the brains behind the civil rights movement, advising Martin Luther King and the others, who said that leadership should be decentralized. No more cult of personality with male preachers that taking orders. That no, wherever you are a leader. And they put all of this together, and they decided that the civil rights struggle needed to transform into an intense nationalistic struggle. And they went to Malcolm as early as 1962, and they formed the Revolutionary Action Movement, which eventually hosted the first African-American Students Nationalist Conference at Fisk University in May of 1964. My father was a student at Fisk at the time. And out of that student conference came a resolve to build a nationalist movement in the United States at the same time that liberation and nationalist movements were forming and organizing on the African continent. So there's this global African liberation movement going on that we were a part of. Malcolm X was a field marshal in the Revolutionary Action Movement as early as 1962. And they realized that it was going to require armed struggle. In the same way that Nelson Mandela, who was an egghead, nerdy lawyer in South Africa, goes to Ethiopia in 1961 or 1962, meets with Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, who tells them, if you really want to liberate your people, you're going to need military training. Nelson Mandela stayed in Ethiopia for 4 months. He got specific military training from Ethiopia's highest general at the time and returned to South Africa as an African liberation militant military leader. Revolutionary Action Movement was undergoing that same process. Eventually, Malcolm X goes to Africa. He meets with the AN, with some other liberation movements on his first trip, returns back to America, gets with Henrik, explains to him and others what was going on in the global African liberation movement. John Henrik Clarke then says, okay, we have to follow the instructions that were given by Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, that we needed to form a united front that speaks for all African Americans. And that's when they wrote the charter, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Okay? That was in June of 1964. All of this is leading up to what is going to become the Republic of New Africa. All of this comes out of a Malcolm X society history that is not taught in schools and is not taught outside the conscious community anywhere in the world. So Malcolm X then, in July of 1964, as the official spokesperson and international representative of the reserve status at the newly formed Organization of African Unity. By this point, 33 liberation movements and 33 nations had gained their independence and now had the machinery of state government, independent government. And they formed this Organization of African Unity. And one of the first things the Organization of African Unity did was they set up what's called the African Liberation Committee. And the main goal of the Organization of African Unity through the African Liberation Committee was to help all the other independence and liberation movements achieve victory, liberate the continent of Africa, rid them from their colonial masters, so that they could become independent. That was the main goal of the African Liberation Committee of the Organization of Africa. Malcolm X, as the representative for liberation and independence movement, was invited and given observer status to attend the second summit of the OAU. When he went, this was his second trip to Africa, Malcolm's second trip. When he went, he stayed on the boat called the Isis. This was a boat that was docked in the Nile, where all of the independence and liberation movements leaders were housed. So here is Malcolm X with the liberation leaders in Africa. They're sitting around, they're networking, they're eating, Malcolm submits a memo and saying, look, if apartheid in South Africa is wrong, then racism in the United States is wrong. And he says, our problems are your problems, speaking to the African heads of states. Your problems are our problems, and our problems are your problems. And then he urges the African heads of state to do for our independence and liberation movement what they were doing for SWAPO, Southwest African Peoples Organization in Namibia, and the ANC in South Africa, and bring our case before the World Court. At this time, Ethiopia and Liberia had brought the case of the people, the liberation movement in Southwest Africa, which would eventually become Namibia. They brought that case to the International Court of Justice. And the world was mobilizing around this anti-apartheid. And Malcolm was there to say, we need the world to mobilize against anti-racism and support our independence movement. So Malcolm returns from that meeting at the OAU, reports back to the Revolutionary Action Movement. And the Revolutionary Action Movement by this time had realized that Malcolm could no longer be a field marshal directing the underground armed struggle and be the international spokesperson. So it was decided to separate the two, that the armed liberation units that were already organized and receiving training and were preparing to do the same thing that the ANC, do the same thing that the freedom fighters in Zimbabwe, do the same freedom fighters in the Mau Mau were doing, the same thing that African freedom fighters everywhere were doing. We were given the same set of instructions. And we were preparing to do the same thing. Haile Selassie and the African Liberation Committee said, in order to receive our assistance, you have to do two things. You have to have a united front and you have to demonstrate military capacity, because the OAU didn't want to waste resources on fake revolutionaries who had no military capacity. So Malcolm returns to the United States, explains this to the Revolutionary Action Movement and its various, and they start taking actions. He goes to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Why? Because that was the headquarters of the OAU, African Liberation Committee. That's where they had their headquarters. And there he meets with the president of Uganda, the president of Kenya, the president of Tanzania. That's Julius Nyerere. It's Milton Obote. It's Mokenya, that's Babu, and others. And it was decided that there would be military training provided for Revolutionary Action Movement forces, especially coming out of Chicago. This is about his third visit to Africa, where he went and what he did. And he reaches to do a series of speeches where he's explaining the newly formed Organization of Afro-American Unity. He's exhorting others that we have from the right directions, and that he has now for us what Ethiopia and Liberia did for their liberation movement, and take our case to the World Court. So this is in October of 1964. Malcolm then tries to go to France. They deny him. You have November, December, January, February, 4 months, and then he's assassinated. In that same time period, Pino Gama Pinto, his contact in the Kenyan government that was going to be a party to this case at the ICJ, is assassinated by the CIA. His Burundi contact is also assassinated. That's another aspect. We don't ever talk about how Malcolm was, it wasn't just Malcolm assassinated at this time working on this case. So I like to explain, people don't understand the context that the Revolutionary Action Movement and the New African Independence Movement was not some isolated fringe radical thing happening in the same assistance, and we were following the same order in having indabas. We were in contact with the other liberation movement leaders, PAIGC in Cape Verde. So you have Amilcar Cabral comes to the United States. We have to teach New African and the Republic of New Africa history in this global context so people will understand just how close we were to actually having our independence recognized and it becoming a reality. When they assassinated Malcolm, it was those who were in the know about all of this that formed the Malcolm X Society that eventually called this Black Government Conference that declared independence and established the Republic of New Africa. So I like to tell that history because that is not generally known. People don't understand. We look with respect and reverence to the African liberation fight that was going on in the continent without really understanding that we were contemporaneous with it and we were doing the same thing. And I like to emphasize that. And now at this time, I'd like to stop and give the floor to Mama Efia, who is a champion of that very Malcolm X society. And so as a lineage elder in the very history that I just gave, um, um, still actively leading the Malcolm X Society, I'd like to give her the floor and let her comment on some of that history that I just detailed. Mama Efia?
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's welcome her. I never met her before. Efia, I don't know what it means, but Mwangaza, Nuru, Mwangaza. It means light or something help you to see where you are going to. So Mwangaza, it means something like that in Kiswahili. So Mwangaza will be light or it will be like, yeah, it's light, like light. So welcome Efia Mwangaza, karibu sana.
Thank you. Efia means girl born on Friday. It's Twi, one of the Akan languages, Ghana. And in practical terms, Wangaza means monitor, teacher, enlightener. My first name is a statement of fact, and the last is given by my community, a statement of aspiration. Frankly, I had only prepared to be an observer in this session. So I will simply say that as a SNCC veteran, member of the Atlanta Project, which was the nexus between SNCC, the Nation of Islam, or more accurately, Malcolm X, and the unit of SNCC that wrote the Atlanta Project Black Power position paper, for which Stokely Carmichael, currently known as Kwame Ture, and Willie Mukasa Ricks received a great deal of popular recognition and acclaim. The project was the co-authors of that and formed in the Southern unit, in the southern section of the United States, one of, if not the only, training force in the region. There were other armed forces like the Deacons for Defense and Robert Williams in North Carolina branch of the NAACP, but we were with Bram and did training in the Atlanta area. We also were the ones to call what is not also not recorded, the first Black Power Conference, which was held in the spring of 1966 in New Orleans. The resource people were John Hendrick Clark, Keith E. Baird, and James Campbell. Seemed to me there was a fourth person whose name escapes me at the moment, but it was at that time that historic spectrum was presented, and our role in the emerging African liberation movement. It was soon after that we were able to force, and I intentionally use the term force, the SNCC establishment, James Foreman, Kwame Ture, Cortland Cox, Cleveland Sellers, a number of other integration phase Snickers to address the question of self-determination, Black Power having been coined by Richard Wright, having been revived by Adam Clayton Powell in 1965 at a formal address at the Howard University School of Law. And out of that, he challenged us as a people to exercise, as he put it, what's in our hand in order to establish what we needed, which he pronounced as being Black Power. Obviously, at this point, Malcolm had been murdered. And through group study and group authorship, we published the Atlanta Project position paper calling for Black Power, which was repudiated by the SNCC establishment that I just described, with others, but they were the leading spokespersons at the time. Julian Bond had already been elected and seated in the Georgia House General Assembly after great struggle. So he was gone, and with the election of Kwame, John Lewis had migrated to COFO, which was a coalition for electoral politics. So it was, SNCC had come fully into a crossroads as to the question of desegregation / integration versus nationalism - self-determination. The Atlanta Project, after having forced the organization to embrace self-determination, and Kwame in his opportunism called for Black Power when he was on the Selma to Montgomery March with Martin Luther King. And if you watch the Eyes on the Prize episode for the Selma March, you see King and Kwame walking along together, and the press giving all of the attention to King. Kwame, in his role as Star Michael, found that intolerable, and by the end of the day, having sent Mukasa out, the Pied Piper that he was and is, to gather folk along the route. And I don't like to use the term training, but inspiring, instructing them to call for Black Power, did so at the end of the evening. And you see that where the Mississippi troopers, Alabama troopers, have attacked the encampment with tear gas and billy clubs, and Kwame calls for Black Power. That was a very bitter struggle. There's a book entitled State on Freedom, written by Dan Berger, which has come out in the past year, and it's the first real account of the struggle for Black Power within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the hostility that we met, and the project being dismantled and us driven out of the organization. However,
Efia, your Mama Efia, you need to come off mute. Somehow you got there.
Okay. At any rate, we were able to at least launch the concept, which was never adequately defined, translated into operative terms beyond the quasi-electoral process, as is represented by participation in the Democrat Party and the electoral system, even as it's represented today. The evolution, its evolution into the Republic of New Africa was severely stunted and remains to this day, to the extent that it continues to exist, a minority positions.
Mama Efia, if I could ask you a question, appreciate all of the gems and revelations, analysis, and on that part, particularly the Black Power part of it. Can you speak a little bit towards the formation of the Malcolm X Society and that and their sort of taking the mantle and how that resulted in the Black Government Conference?
Frankly, I don't have any real folk from the Atlanta Project who migrated to the Northeast, which is where the Malcolm X Society was based, and who continued the Malcolm's work and were actually even present and participating in the Declaration of Independence. However, again, they were largely folk in the New York, Philadelphia, to a lesser degree area. You have to remember that when I first became involved with SNCC in Atlanta, the Friends of Nick person in Philadelphia prior to that was still a it was a lot of moving parts at that point in time, and work that of the society, the formation and work of the society was more a northeastern venture. My work with John Churchville and Bill Strickland, founders of the Northern Student Movement, former Southern SNCC workers, and James Turner and some of the other seniors at that point, my seniors were the ones who carried on the society. I was a high school student at that point.
So thank you again, Mama Effie. And for people that are really unfamiliar with this history or some of the names and people that she mentioned, one way for me to contextualize it is that in the same way that John Henrik Clarke, Sheikh Anta Diop, Chancellor Williams said, you can't understand the history of Kemet, ancient Egypt, unless you understand the prehistory of Kemet, right? In the same way, you can't really understand the history of the Republic of New Africa unless you understand the prehistory, which Mama Efia was really giving us a deep dive in some of the relationships. So I just want to put that out there for people that aren't so familiar, may have never heard those names. The Republic of New Africa did not spring up overnight as just some great new idea that just came out of nowhere. It has many roots. The SNCC Black Power is a main root that eventually grew this tree that we call Republic of New Africa. And if I could share my screen here for a minute, Mama Efia, you had said, the land project is shot. I do want to let people know that we do have a course, right? It's New African Diplomatic and Civil Service Certifying course. In this course, we go into great detail about these things. The course has 6 components, 5 textbooks. It's over 1,200 pages that teaches the New African story in the context of the global African liberation story. It literally shows you that, for example, in this month in 1963, when the Birmingham church was being bombed, and our response to that, right, this was going on at the port of Pidjuiti in Guinea-Bissau, and how the liberation forces responded to that. So you can see that everything that we went through part of this global warfare. And it's better to teach our history that way. And so when we get to lesson 21, which is New Africans and their just struggle and the evolution of RAM, and we start talking about Robert Williams, we go into the roots of SNCC and its relationship to a lot of the people that Mama Ifya mentioned, the Atlanta Project, the struggle within SNCC. A lot of it was gleaned from, I didn't read the book, Mama Ifya, that you mentioned. It just came out, but I will since you now mentioned it. But a lot of the information is coming from We Will Return in the Whirlwind, Black radical organizations from 1960 to 1975, which was written by Maxwell Stanford, who is now known as Muhammad Ahmad, who was a main protagonist in this history. So people who are wanting structured learning in this, besides reading some of the books, we actually have a course. And you can see, for example, at this period, not only did we have the development of Black Power and Republic of New Africa, you had the Zimbabwe African National Union, founded, right, 1963. You have the National Liberation of the Comoros, the National Independence Front. You have all of these things. So we teach the New African Independence movement in the context of these other movements. And with that, I'd like to ask you one more question, Mama Ifya, along the line, which is what impact did the international African liberation movement have on you personally, or SNCC, or the organizations that you were affiliated with at that time? What level of knowledge and intimacy did you have, say, in 1960 to 1968 about these African liberation movements and our connection to them?
First of all, my parents were Ghanaites. Like some folks, I wasn't introduced to the movement or stumbled upon it. I was born into the movement. My father was a minister and my mother a missionary. The church, Apostolic Faith, had branches in the Caribbean and in Africa. So I grew up with an international perspective. In fact, my first assignment out of undergraduate school was to go to Liberia to state of the institution or in the school. That perspective in all of my political activity, recognizing our responsibility to African people. My sisters and I were among those who defeated the will of Stephen Girard, a financier in Philadelphia who built a school for white male orphans using money that he had stolen from was a gun runner. And instead of returning guns to Haiti for the Haitian Revolution, he created a financial empire. We were able to defeat that with many of our relationship to the Haitian Revolution that inspired our efforts to defeat White's attorney, to continue that effort with work not only through SNCC, which had international relationships, both and Cuba, that were a natural part of my own evolution and development, resulting in, while in law school, participating in the drafting of the law of the sea treaty, to which the United States still refuses to be a signatory to control the activities around the mining of the sea. The organizations with which I have been involved have always been Pan-Africanists, in the sense that they have always recognized our relationship with African people and with Africa. While there are questions about the nature of those connections, the connections are firm nonetheless.
If I could interrupt you real quick about those connections, this was just a question, which was, to what extent were you and the people around you aware of how closely connected Malcolm was to these other African liberation movements and their leadership?
Thoroughly. Max Stanford was one of my mentors. So there was never a point in time when we were not aware of our relationship to emerging African nations. Because, as I mentioned, Wing recognized the relationship between Africans here in the U.S. The king was at the independence ceremonies for Ghana.
Ghana, yes.
So there was no time where there was not that awareness. I think what might be a point of distinction is the willingness to recognize and train for armed resistance. That, I think, is the basic, and operated on the relationship, the difference, remain nonviolent, and those of us who viewed nonviolence as a tactic as opposed to a philosophy always recognize the necessity for military preparation.
Thank you.
Comrade Imani?
Yes. Sorry for that. Sorry for interruption, Madam Mwangaza. Sorry for that. There is a hand being raised by Abdul Latif. I want to address that, but before I do that, let me tell you that we are New Africa Network. We are live. Me, I'm here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, of course, and I want to inform you that next week, next Thursday, we're gonna have Mr. Jimmy Sherzier, Barbecue or General Sherzier, who is gonna be talking to us. That's on Thursday, and then on Friday, he's gonna be answering your questions. So I will like to make sure that you guys understand that we're gonna have him so you can ask him questions. That being said, let's give microphone to who raised the hand? Abdul, what was his name again? Latif. Latif, microphone is yours.
Freedom Land. I'm Brother John B. Lamar, conscious citizen of the Republic of New Africa. And what was on my mind was when you had first asked the question about the difference between the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the Republic of New Africa. And then as that went on, listening to Brother Siphiwe and Mama Ifia highlight different metamorphoses and differences in the struggle as it evolved. One thing I like to place particular focus on is, we have back at that time, even before the UNIA was created, there was a lot of differences of opinion within the Black freedom struggle as to exactly the course that the movement should go. You had difference between Frederick Douglass and Martin R. Delaney. Then you had difference between Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois. And then following that, the movement continued. And then played a crucial and critical role in our struggle for liberation. And as Mama Fia just mentioned right now, that the Republic of Africa is kind of a minority in the struggle. And getting back at that, one thing I would like to focus on is when Gold in Detroit, they issued a Declaration of Independence and declared our motto and our battle cry to free the land. And there was a strategy behind that. And I like to refer to Amari Abadeli's book, War in America, the Malcolm X Doctrine, which laid out and outlined our basic political and military strategies for achieving liberation. There have been several brothers from back then who have commented on it and expounded on some different aspects of the War in America and how it could be improved, but it still laid down the basic strategy for focusing on the South instead of the North, as it was primary, because we could defend the South. And another thing is that when we always going back into the history, it's always good to speak about the history to learn where we come from so we can understand where we're at and make any reapprisement that needed to adjust for the lessons that we learned. But I don't think that we should I see a lot of nostalgia going on around our history, and the movement becomes kind of stagnated, and we just not do what's necessary. Because when you mentioned the liberation struggles that ran parallel to the movement in the United States for Blacks, those liberation struggles and movements were declared in the late 50s, and most of them succeeded in gaining independence within 10 to 15 years. So by comparison, we're overdue. So when we look at the struggle for New African liberation, I think that we need to try to understand that we need to accelerate and expedite to make up for time lost and ground lost, and that our strategy for revolutionizing and liberation need to be an accelerated and expedited plan and strategy that has a sense of urgency. You know, I've seen several different movements in recent times in South America, and including even within the the Black movement in America that sprouted up and within a short period of time was able to galvanize the masses in a large and very significant way, including even the Republic of New Africa in its first 5 years, achieving a 5,000 membership following before 1975, between 68 and 75. And I think that we can replicate that if we focus on hey, what we can do and what we need to do to deal with the internal divisions within the Republic of New Africa independence movement, within the Black nationalist movement overall, and going larger to the differences and divisions spoke about by Siphiwe when she said that SNCC had the divisions with the civil rights movement and the civil rights leadership, and Stokely became kind of like opportunists, you know. But in focusing on those things, I think that those are things that we need to address and start speaking to as to the lessons we can learn from that history to kind of expedite and achieve within the next 10 years what those liberation movements over there achieved within their first 10 and 15 years. I yield.
Let me thank my good comrade, Brother Lukeman. And I see there's another hand raised, but Comrade Imani, before I want to pick up on something that our good comrade Lukeman said. He mentioned this document called War in America, right? And this is a part of the history and the understanding that's going to help us do what Comrade Lukeman just said, which is, get with the present now, accelerate our struggle. But people need to understand that Mario Bedelli wrote this War in America tract in October 1966. Okay. It was intended to escalate. War was waged on. This is why I started in the beginning saying, look, war was declared and waged on us back in 1452. We were invaded, then we were trafficked across the Americas as prisoners of war, and then suffered chattel enslavement and ethnocide at the same time that we went through the process of ethnogenesis and became the nation of New Africa. So we didn't declare the war was declared on us, and we were invaded. But those who were clear about what had happened to us, and particularly Mario Bedelli in October 1966, wrote this War in America. And he was saying, the crucial first step is the early acceptance of an essential and inevitable decision by those who seek Black state power. Again, building on what Mama Efia was talking about and how this Black power concept was developed, what it achieved, what it didn't achieve, its relationship to the Republic of New Africa. He says the decision to withdraw the state, ultimately withdraw the entire new 5-state union of Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina from the United States and establish a separate nation, right? He goes on to then talk about how